In 1861, a quiet Wisconsin town swallowed its own sins with full bellies and empty consciences. They called it pork. They said nothing when children vanished. And at the heart of it all stood the Keller Farmhouse, its smokehouse burning long after the meat should have run out. This isn't folklore. It's not a ghost story. This is what happens when hunger becomes belief, and belief becomes blood. Before you sit down to dinner tonight, ask yourself, do you really know what you're eating? Or who? They say memory softens the edges of horror, that time wraps its quiet shroud around the screams until they sound like nothing more than the wind through brittle leaves. But I remember everything, every sickly sweet stench, every flicker of movement through the cornfields at dusk, every smile too wide and every silence too long. And even now, more than 3 decades after I last stood at the edge of the Keller Farmhouse, I can still taste the iron tang in the air that warned us all too late of what was coming. I hadn't planned on returning to Kellwood Hollow. In fact, I'd done everything I could to pretend it never existed, burying it beneath a life of dull routines and faraway cities. But then came the letter, and signed, barely legible, just a single sentence scrawled across yellowing paper. She never left the cellar. That was all it took to break the dam. The nightmares that had slunk into corners of my mind came rushing back with terrifying clarity. And before I could stop myself, I was on a train slicing through the Wisconsin wilderness toward the town that had learned long ago how to forget. The year was 1892, but Kettlewood Hollow hadn't changed much since the summer of 1861. The roads were still muddy, the buildings bowed by time and snow, and the people wore the same tight-lipped expressions of those who knew too much and said too little. My return wasn't welcomed. It was endured. The station master barely nodded, and when I asked about the Kellers, his face turned to stone. "Ain't nothing left there but weeds and rot," he muttered before vanishing into the fog like a ghost ashamed of being seen. But I wasn't here for small talk. I was here because my sister, Margaret, had vanished one August evening after accepting a delivery job for Abram Keller, and no one, not the sheriff, not the preacher, not even my own mother, had ever tried to find her. They said she ran off with a railroad man. They said she'd wanted out. But I knew Margaret. She was fire and defiance and loyalty wrapped in sunburnt skin, and she would never have left without saying goodbye. I was 16 when it happened, and in the chaotic month that followed, the war tearing through headlines, men vanishing into uniforms, crops dying under relentless sun. No one had time to look for a girl who wasn't born rich or white. But I looked. I searched the field behind the Keller farm, where the corn grew too tall, and the scarecrows always looked like they were watching. I knocked on their door, and Hester Keller, eyes sharp as butcher's blades, told me in her quiet voice that Margaret had never arrived. "We're all accounted for," she said, her fingers slick with something dark and unidentifiable. The smokehouse behind her let out a hiss, and I remember how the wind changed, bringing with it a scent that made my stomach turn. Meaty, metallic, wrong. But I was just a boy, and the war gave people excuses to disappear. No one believed me, and eventually I stopped talking. But the silence never sat right. Years passed. I moved to Milwaukee, then to Chicago, worked factory floors and boxed at underground rings, drank more than I should have, and told myself that Margaret had probably made it somewhere better. But then the letter came. She never left the cellar. Not she's dead or she was taken. No, it said she never left. Present tense. As if she were still there. As if the Keller house still held its secrets, buried beneath boards and brambles. When I arrived at the ruins of the Keller farmhouse, the sky was already bleeding into evening. The structure was barely standing, half collapsed, roof sunken like a broken spine, the windows nothing more than hollow sockets. But it was exactly as I remembered. The air felt thick, like the world itself was holding its breath. I stepped over the gate, long rusted off its hinges, and followed the worn path to the front porch. The wood groaned beneath my weight, and for a moment I hesitated, heart pounding with the kind of dread that comes not from fear, but recognition. I'd stood here before. I'd heard Margaret laugh somewhere behind that door once. I pushed it open. The smell hit first, dust, mold, something older beneath it, something that clung to the lungs. The living room was frozen in time, a Bible left open on a warp table, a child's doll slumped against the fireplace, its face cracked in half. I wandered deeper, past the kitchen where rusted knives still hung on hooks, past the pantry whose floorboards looked recently disturbed. My hand moved instinctively to the loose plank I remembered from a decade ago, where Abram once pulled out a flask during one of the rare community gatherings. The plank lifted easily. Beneath it, darkness. A cellar, unmarked, narrow, stinking. The ladder creaked as I descended, flashlight trembling in my hand. The space below was colder than it should have been, lined with stone and packed earth. But it was what hung from the rafters that made me stop breathing. Chains. Dozens of them. Some with manacles. Some with worn leather straps. And in the corner, something even worse. A pile of bones, some gnawed, some split. They were not old. My vision swam. I tried to step back, but my foot caught on something soft. I looked down. Fabric. A shawl. Margaret's favorite color. I recognized the pattern. My scream never left my throat. I stumbled out, coughing, eyes burning, rage and sorrow collapsing into each other like waves in a storm. She'd never left. They'd never even buried her. That night, I stayed at the local inn, a bottle of rock gut, my only companion. The letter burning a hole in my coat pocket. I didn't sleep. Instead, I began writing this account because someone needs to remember. Someone needs to know that beneath the soil of Kettlewood Hollow, there's a history of hunger, cruelty, and betrayal that cannot be forgotten. This isn't just about Margaret. It's about every soul swallowed by that farmhouse. About the people who knew and said nothing. About the meals that were served and the meat that was sold. About how desperation makes monsters of us all. And this is only the beginning. Before the name Keller became something the townsfolk of Kettlewood Hollow dared not whisper even on windless nights, before it was etched into the back of my skull like a brand I could never scrub away, it was simply a name, common, unremarkable, as much a part of the countryside as the corn and mud. But beneath its plainness festered a rot so complete that even now, after all this time, I can still feel the weight of it pressing on my chest when I think of their house and the people who lived there. The Kellers arrived in town around 1849, long before I was born, riding in on a creaking wagon drawn by 2 mules and carrying nothing but crates of butcher tools, salted meats, and a baby swaddled in linens too clean for farmers. They settled on the edge of the hollow, where the forest pressed too close and the soil was strangely dark, building their farmhouse with the help of no one, never asking for assistance, never attending church. Abram Keller, the patriarch, was a towering man with shoulders like a bear and a face carved from old oak, never smiling, never blinking more than necessary. He spoke in low, methodical tones, words measured like a butcher weighing meat. And even as a child I knew instinctively that you didn't speak while he was in the room. You listened or you left. Hester, his wife, was the opposite. Small, tightly wound, eyes darting like she was always watching for a hand to strike her, and yet despite that unease, she ran the Keller household like a general. No waste, no fuss, no warmth. The townsfolk didn't ask many questions. They needed meat, and the Kellers provided it. Cheap, fresh, plentiful, even when other farms were struggling, even when livestock went missing elsewhere. That should have been a warning. But hunger dulled suspicion, and the smell of smoked pork did more to calm nerves than any sermon ever could. The Keller children, 5 in all, were another matter. I remember them in flashes. Isaac, the eldest, barely spoke and carried a skinning knife even at Sunday markets. Ruth, the only girl, had a strange way of smiling, like she knew things she shouldn't, always humming the same lullaby no one could place. Caleb, silent and wild-eyed, often seen staring at animals just before they vanished. The twins, Ephraim and Elias, identical and inseparable, always watching, always whispering to each other in a language only they seemed to understand. My mother once said they weren't raised so much as sharpened. I grew up down the hill from the Kellers, and though our families never mixed, I ended up in their orbit more often than I liked, delivering eggs, helping with hay during harvest, passing Ruth in the woods where she gathered herbs, and always seemed to be listening for something just out of hearing. The first time I entered their home, I was 9, and I remember the walls being strangely warm, almost too warm, and the smell, beneath the usual sense of rendered fat and smoked meat, there was something else, something faintly sweet, like rotting fruit and copper. Hester handed me a biscuit with a thick red smear I assumed was jam. I didn't eat it. Years later, I'd remember that moment and feel the bile rise in my throat. By 1858, people had started noticing things. Livestock disappearing, travelers not reaching the next town, odd sounds echoing at night, but nothing that stuck. The sheriff came by once, but left with a basket of ham and a bottle of corn whiskey, his concerns dulled by full belly and blurred memory. The Kellers thrived in silence. What struck me most, though, even as a boy, was how insulated they were. Not isolated, insulated, like nothing from outside ever reached them and nothing inside ever got out. They didn't attend school, didn't speak unless spoken to, and yet there was a sort of unity to them, a hive-like coordination that made your skin crawl if you watched them long enough. I once saw Hester flick her fingers in some strange motion during a town gathering, and all 5 children rose from their seats at once and left, single file, eyes forward. It wasn't natural, but the town needed them. When the war broke out in 1861, many of the able-bodied men were drafted or volunteered, and food became scarcer. The Kellers didn't enlist. Someone must feed the living, Abram had said at a town meeting, and no one questioned him. If anything, they leaned on the Keller supply more than ever. Ham, sausages, briskets, plentiful and affordable even during famine. They raised their pigs in secret, people said. They have a secret breed, others claimed. The truth was, no one ever saw these animals. They arrived already butchered, already processed, and people were too hungry to care. I was 15 when I worked a summer on the Keller farm, something I volunteered for, hoping to save money and keep an eye on Margaret, who had taken a liking to Ruth Keller, despite my warnings. "They're just weird," she said, laughing. "So are we. But there's weird, and then there's wrong." From the first day I arrived at the farmhouse, I felt it, a weight, a presence, not ghostly or supernatural, but real and oppressive, like the very walls were watching. Abram didn't speak to me for the first week. He simply pointed where I needed to go. Hester was more involved, watching how I cleaned, how I lifted, how I carried. The children said little. Meals were silent. There were no mirrors in the house. At night, the sound started scraping beneath the floorboards, like something crawling, dragging itself from room to room. I tried to tell myself it was rats, but rats don't sigh, and they don't whisper your name. Still I stayed. Hunger was hunger. But what began to shake me most wasn't the noises or the smells. It was the look in Ruth's eyes whenever she watched the Smokehouse. Not fear, not curiosity. Reverence, like it was a chapel. I once asked her what they were curing that day. She smiled and said, "Nothing that didn't want to be eaten." I thought it was a joke. I laughed. She didn't. That summer, one of the town boys went missing. Henry Abbott. His parents were devastated. The town searched for a week. Nothing was found. The Kellers donated sausage to the community feast that Sunday. No one asked questions. I went home that night and vomited until I bled. Still, I told no one. Fear isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a quiet voice that tells you to wait, to watch, to survive. And survive I did. I left afar in that fall and never returned. But the taste of that place, the weight of its air, never left me. When Margaret disappeared a year later, I already knew. I knew where to look. I knew who to blame. But no one listened. Not until it was far too late. The Kellers were not just a family. They were a system, a ritual, a hunger passed down through blood and obedience. And the more I learned, the more I understood that what we thought was oddness was something much darker, something methodical, ancient, and patient. They had lived among us, fed us, smiled at us, all while hiding a truth so vile that would fracture our town beyond repair. But I didn't yet know the worst of it. Not then. That would come later, in blood and revelation. For now, I only knew this. The Kellers were not done. Not yet. There are certain smells that never leave you, that burrow into your sinuses and cling to your memory with claws. And for me, that smell was the one that seeped from the Keller Smokehouse every time the wind shifted, and I was anywhere near that godforsaken farm. The heavy, cloying scent of burning would layer with something sweeter, denser, something unmistakably wrong. like meat left too long in the sun but still cooked with pride. And though no one ever said it out loud, we all knew, deep down, that no pig or cow had ever made that smell, no deer or rabbit either. It was something else, something human, and yet we swallowed it down with our suppers like it was nothing, because we were starving in more ways than one. The summer I worked there, I was given chores that took me close to that smokehouse every day, hauling wood, cleaning tools, carrying salted slabs to the storage barn. And at first I told myself it was all in my head, just nerves, just superstition, but it wasn't. I know that now. The first time I saw inside, I'd been sent by Hester to retrieve a special cut for one of the wealthier families in town. And when I opened the door, the heat hit me like a punch, thick and oily, and the interior was cast in a deep, reddish haze from the burning coals, the racks above them dripping slow fat that sizzled as it fell. And I remember seeing something on the far wall, a leg, I thought at first, but longer, more sinewy, with a distinct curve of hip and foot that couldn't belong to any animal I knew. And then Ruth appeared behind me, silent as ever, her hand suddenly on my shoulder, her voice calm and flat as she said, "Some things need more time to cure," before guiding me out and handing me a tightly wrapped package without another word. That night, I sat in the shed behind our house and unwrapped the package. Inside was a roast, pink and marbled, but the smell hit me so hard I had to step outside and vomit into the dirt. I buried it before sunrise, afraid to ask, afraid to know. From that moment on, I started paying closer attention, watching the way the family moved, how they communicated without words, how the children always seemed to appear exactly where they were needed, and how no one, not once, ever brought livestock to property, yet the meat never ran out. I began to notice things others chose to ignore, the way the chopping blocks were worn not just by knives but by teeth, as though someone had bitten down hard and often, the stains that never quite washed out of the barrels, the little bones, too small to be animal, scattered in the woods behind the house. But I kept quiet, because what was I supposed to say? That I believed the Kellers were butchering people? That our neighbors, our friends, might have eaten something unspeakable because the price was right and the hunger too loud? Even my mother wouldn't have believed me, especially not after Margaret started spending more time there. She'd taken to helping Hester with canning, she said, and Ruth had grown fond of her, taught her recipes. I tried to warn her. I tried to tell her that the Kellers weren't just strange. They were dangerous, but she laughed it off, called me dramatic. I think now she was trying to protect me. Maybe she knew more than she let on. Maybe she saw something she couldn't explain and decided to stay close, to gather proof, to keep her friend safe. But I'll never know, because one day she went out to farm a basket of herbs and didn't come back. I remember that day like a scar, how the sky was gray and flat, how the air tasted of rain and wood smoke, how I ran up the hill to the farmhouse and banged on the door until my fist bled, only for Hester to open it slowly, her hands covered in flour, her expression unreadable. "Margaret never arrived," she said, voice level. "Perhaps she found her own path." I knew she was lying. I could see it in the faint smear of something dark beneath her sleeve, the way the children watched in the shadows, like dogs trained to sit still until command came. But no one believed me. The sheriff told me to go home. My mother cried, but said nothing, and the town moved on. That winter, the Kellers held a large butchering sale, fresh meat, smoked hams, sausages packed in spices and brine, and nearly every family bought something. My mother brought home a roast. I couldn't eat. I watched as she and my father chewed, smiling, talking about how tender it was, how rich the flavor. I felt my stomach twisting on itself, and I knew then, deep in my marrow, that Margaret was gone, not missing, not lost, gone, consumed, made into something unrecognizable and sold by the pound. That knowledge hollowed me out. I stopped speaking. I stopped sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her shawl, her hands, her laugh, her body hanging in that smokehouse beside all the others. I tried to leave town, but I couldn't. Not until I had proof, not until I made them pay. So I returned to the farm, not as a worker, but as a watcher. I hid in the woods at night, memorizing their routines. I watched how Abram would lock the barn every evening with a padlock older than sin, how the children would carry something heavy and cover from the woodshed to the smokehouse under the cover of darkness, how the chimneys smoked red late into the night. And then one night I saw it, the twins dragging a body, limp and barefoot, across the field. I couldn't see the face, but the shape, the hair, it looked like the preacher's son, who hadn't been seen in days. I ran to town, screamed until someone listened. By morning, the preacher was missing too, and the Kellers, they were at the market, selling sausages, smiling. That was the last time I saw them before the storm hit, before everything unraveled. But even now, when the wind shifts just right, I can smell it, that blend of smoke and iron, and I remember what we all pretended not to know, that hunger wears many faces, and sometimes the worst monsters are the ones who feed us. The first time I saw beneath the Keller barn was not out of courage, but out of desperation, dragged there by a man half drunk and wholly haunted, who whispered to me through cracked lips that the truth's under the wood, and in the summer of 1865, with Margaret Long. Gone, my childhood a corpse in the field, and the town twisting itself in guilt-shaped knots. I followed him into that barn like a man stepping into his own grave, because by then I was no longer afraid of dying. I was afraid of forgetting, afraid that everything Margaret was would be erased by silence and smoke. So when Earl Dawson, once the town's loudest gossip, now gone and gray, his eyes red-rimmed and full of something broken, pulled me aside behind the tavern, and said he had something too. Show me. I didn't ask questions, didn't hesitate, because I saw in his trembling hands and blood-stained cuffs the mark of someone who'd seen the same rot I had and couldn't carry it alone. The barn loomed at the edge of the Keller property, just beyond a wilted orchard where no apples grew any more, and the scarecrows hung not in defense but in warning. And as Earl led me across the overgrown field, the moonlight cutting pale scars across the land, he muttered over and over that he should have spoken sooner, that the things he'd heard from inside that barn at night were not made by animals, that the screams didn't fade like they should have, that the laughter, oh God, the laughter was always a little too high, too soft, like it came from mouths too small to know what pain meant. And by the time we reached the barn doors, I felt like I was walking through a dream gone rancid, the kind where your legs work but your soul dragged behind. The doors were unlocked, which should have been my first warning, but Earl said they never locked them now, not since Abram disappeared and the others scattered like roaches in daylight. And as we stepped inside, the stench hit like a physical force, mold, piss, rot, and beneath it all that same sweet metallic perfume of death that had followed me from the smokehouse all those years ago. The floor was coated in dust, footprints long gone, but Earl went straight to the back, to a stack of empty feed sacks, and began moving them with a trembling urgency until he revealed a trapdoor, iron hinges, would blackened by time and soot, and he looked at me then, eyes glassy, and said, "If you go down there, you won't come back the same," and then he opened it anyway. The descent was short, maybe 10 steps, but every second stretched like a noose tightening around the throat, and as my boots touched the packed dirt below, the lantern in Earl's hand revealed a space that wasn't just hidden. It had been carved out with intent, with purpose, with devotion, and every wall was lined with hooks, with shelves, with old rusted tools that had no names but held stories in their dried red sheen. And scattered across the ground were bones. Some animal, yes, but others, unmistakably human. A child's femur here, a woman's rib there, all gnawed, cracked, polished by time and perhaps something worse. And in the center of the cellar, surrounded by dried blood that had turned black and flaked like old paint, was a pit, no more than 4 feet deep. But the stench that rose from it was enough to make me retch, and inside it lay the remains of something that might once have been a body, but was now little more than sinew and teeth. Earl knelt beside it, weeping, and said he'd help bury it once, help cover it up when the sheriff refused a look, when Hester gave him a cut of meat, and a look that promised more if he kept quiet. And now it was all eating him alive, the guilt, the knowing, the way the town had eaten itself from the inside out in its hunger and need. I stood there, numb, my eyes drifting to the walls where scratch marks ran deep, where fingernails were embedded in the wood like desperate graffiti, and I thought of Margaret, of the way she used to sing when she cooked, of the way she'd vanished without a trace. And I realized in that moment that I was standing in her grave, that she might have died right here, inches from where I stood, and no one, not the law, not the church, not even God, had lifted a finger to save her. We left the cellar in silence, sealing the trapdoors if it could contain what we'd seen, and Earl told me he was going to leave town, that he couldn't bear the wait anymore, and I believe him. But 3 days later, they found him hanging from the rafters of his barn, eyes bulging, tongue bitten clean through, and beside him was a note that simply read, We fed the beast. The town barely blinked. Another tragedy. Another silence. But I knew then that the Keller family sins weren't buried. They were fermented, preserved, and waiting, and that whatever had been started in that barn, in that farmhouse, in that smokehouse, was not finished. The house still stood. The cellar still yawned beneath it, and the hunger, that twisted, cultivated hunger, still echoed in every quiet corner of Kettlewood Hollow. And I wasn't just a witness anymore. I was a survivor, a grave digger, and perhaps, if I could summon the strength, a reckoner. But reckoning would come later. For now, I had a name to carve into stone, Margaret, and a town to confront for what it allowed to fester beneath its floorboards. IT began not with a scream, but with silence. A silence so profound it felt like the whole town had inhaled and forgotten how to exhale. And I remember the exact moment the illusion shattered. The precise second when Kettlewood Hollow stopped pretending it didn't know, couldn't see, wouldn't ask, because that was the day young Clara Whitby found a tooth in her mother's stew, a small white molar nestled between chunks of tender meat and onion, glistening and perfect and unmistakably human. And what followed wasn't chaos, but something worse, recognition, that slow, creeping realization that every Sunday roast, every smoked sausage, every savory pie bought from the Keller's market stall may have contained something far more intimate than pork. And the horror didn't hit all at once. It crept, it whispered, it curled around spines and knees, and made people stumble back from their dinner tables and clutch their bellies in revulsion as their minds did the arithmetic of memory, tallying up meals and faces and names now gone. And suddenly the town was no longer safe, no longer silent, because the veil had lifted, and behind it was not madness but method, not ghost but gristle and bone and skin. The tooth was the spark, but the fire had been smoldering for years, and once lit it roared. Neighbors stormed the Keller property in a frenzy, farmers with pitchforks and fathers with rifles, and I was among them, not out of vengeance but necessity, because I had carried this weight for years, this suspicion, this grief without a grave, and now, finally, the town stood beside me, burning with the same dread and disgust that had haunted me since the day Margaret disappeared. The house, as if aware of our arrival, sat quiet and still, its shutters closed, its porch sagging under the weight of rotten time. But we didn't knock, didn't wait. We kicked in the door and flooded the space with footsteps and fury, and what we found inside was not resistance but vacancy, not absence, not escape, but a terrifying, deliberate stillness, as if the Kellers had known this day would come and prepared for it, like one might prepare a feast. The parlor was untouched, the Bible still open, the walls yellowed with smoke, and the fireplace cold. But then we moved deeper, into the pantry, into the cellar, into the hidden rooms, and what we found there tore something primal from our throats. Rows of jars filled with preserved flesh, shelves lined with bones labeled by date. A ledger, yes, a ledger, meticulously kept by Hester, listing names, weights, cuts, prices. Clara's name was there. So was Henry Abbott's. And Margaret's. My hand shook as I read it. The ink smudged by what I swear were tear stains. And in that moment I didn't just hate the Kellers. I hated the town. I hated myself. I hated the hunger that made monsters out of men and customers out of neighbors. But the horror was not yet done. For beneath the barn, beyond the cellar Earl Dawson had shown me, lay another space, sealed by stone, marked with symbols I didn't understand. And when we broke through with pickaxes and crowbars, we uncovered what could only be described as a slaughterhouse, not built for speed or efficiency, but for reverence, for ritual, for worship. There were hooks, yes, and chains, and drains cut into the floor, but there were also carvings on the walls. Words not of faith, but of doctrine, phrases like the flesh sustains, and no part shall be wasted. And worst of all, a mural crudely painted in dried blood depicting a family seated at a dinner table, their hands clasped, their eyes hollow, their plates piled high with what could only be human remains. And seated at the head of the table was Abram Keller, grinning, a knife in one hand and a prayer book in the other. We set fire to the place that night, not out of justice, but out of desperation, as if burning it to cleanse the taste from our tongues, the memories from our minds. But the fire didn't erase the past. It only exposed it, cast it in sharper relief, and in the days that followed the town unraveled like old rope. Families left in droves. The preacher fled without a sermon. The sheriff drank himself into silence. And those of us who remained did so not out of loyalty or resilience, but because we had nowhere else to go, No way to explain to the outside world what we had allowed to happen, what we had consumed. I buried what I could of Margaret, her name carved into a stolen headstone and placed beneath a tree she used to climb. And every day I visited her, I asked forgiveness, not just for failing her, but for eating the food she warned me against, for doubting her instincts, for letting fear paralyze me when she needed action. The Kellers themselves were never found, not Abram, not Hester, not the children. And some say they burned with the house, while others believe they fled into the forest, into the caves, into the dark places where fire cannot reach. But I don't believe they ran. I believe they waited. I believe they watched. Because that hunger, that belief they held, that meat is meat, that survival justifies the unspeakable. It didn't die with the fire. It lives in the shadows of our choices, in the corners of our appetites, and I can still feel it gnawing at the edges of this town, reminding us that beneath the veneer of civility, we are all just one missed meal away from becoming something else. Hunger has a face, and I have seen it. I have eaten with it, and I will carry that knowledge to my grave. The charred remains of the Keller farmhouse smolder for days, thick black smoke curling into the sky, like a funeral pyre for sins too vast to bury, and as the last embers died and the town dared to draw near again, shovel by cautious shovel, stepping through ash and bone, we found what we didn't know we were looking for, a small, iron-bound chest, hidden beneath the floorboards of what used to be the master bedroom, sealed with a rusted latch and the kind of quiet malice that makes your stomach twist before your mind catches up. It was Ruth who found it. Ruth Kavanaugh, not the Keller girl, long since gone, but even she hesitated before lifting the lid, as though some part of her knew that whatever lay inside would change us again, unearth horrors not yet known. And when the lock broke and the hinges groaned, what we saw was not treasure, not evidence, but paper, fragile, yellowed, hand-bound sheets written in the cold, perfect script of Hester Keller herself. A journal not of emotion, but of instruction, not of madness, but of ideology. And it was then, only then, that we began to understand this had never been desperation, never been a tragedy of circumstance, but a doctrine cultivated in silence, a theology of consumption passed from hand to hand like a sacred text. The first pages were clinical, recounting the early days of settlement, how they'd arrived in Kelwood Hollow with nothing but a mule and a child, how the land was unfriendly and the locals untrusting, how Abram had begun butchering deer, then livestock, then more, always more, and how, when the game ran thin and the winter stretched long and cold, they had made a decision not out of panic, but clarity. The flesh must serve the living, she wrote, in looping cursive. All of it. Waste not. Regret not. And with that line, the tone of the diary shifted from historical to philosophical, each entry a blend of household logistics and chilling resolve, detailing cuts, recipes, salting techniques, and most disturbingly moral justifications. What is a soul? She pondered on the 24th of November, 1852. Is it tied to flesh, or does it flee at death's call? If it flees, then the body is merely meat, meat that can feed and preserve, can be shared. Is it not divine to nourish others? There was no remorse in her words, no apology, only certainty, only a matriarch's pride in the order she maintained, the belly she filled, the discipline she instilled in her children, each of whom she described with chilling specificity. Isaac, obedient but slow. Ruth, gifted with charm and tenderness. Ideal for luring. Caleb, fond in process, though sloppy. The twins, interchangeable and efficient. Each child had a role, a task, a sacred duty in the ritual flesh, and their meals were not just sustenance but sacrament. She spoke of the clean kill, of ensuring calm before cutting, of the song they sang before every butchering, a lullaby passed down from her grandmother, who, according to one chilling entry, served the same table in Virginia during the last famine, and before that, the old country. This was not a new hunger. It was a legacy. And as I turned each page, the bile rose higher in my throat, not just because of what they had done, but because of how many I had known. Neighbors who looked away, a preacher who blessed their meat without question, townsfolk who whispered but still bought sausages at a discount. Hester named them. She thanked them. Mr. Dunley provided salt, she wrote. In exchange, his debts were cleared. He knew. He never asked. The most painful page, the one I still dream about, was dated a month before Margaret vanished. "The girl is kind," Hester wrote. "She smiles often. She could have been ours if born different. Her meat will be tender. A shame, but necessary." That sentence broke something in me. Not just a loss, but the casual way it was recorded, as if Margaret had been nothing more than a weather note, a crop report. And in the final pages, the tone shifted again from calm to urgent. The town was changing, she wrote. Outsiders were asking questions. The children were restless. Abram had grown reckless, sloppy, overconfident. "We must retreat," she penned, "not surrender. Prepare. Preserve. They will taste the ash, but not the truth. The line must continue. The hunger cannot die here." That was the final entry, written just days before the fire, and it was then I realized something cold and paralyzing. The Kellers had never planned to stay. They had orchestrated their disappearance. The fire, the supposed deaths. It was all theater, a grand, smoking curtain behind which they vanished into the woods, into the world, to begin again. We shared the diary with no one beyond the circle of those who had already seen the cellar, already tasted the truth. We burned no pages. We did not hide it. We read it, we memorized it, and then we locked away, not out of cowardice, but because we knew the hunger didn't begin with Hester, and it wouldn't end with us. It was a belief passed like infection, a way of life that needed only soil, secrecy, and desperation to grow. And somewhere beyond the charred fields and broken fences of Kettlewood Hollow, it still grew, because Hester was not mad. She was devout, and what she left behind was not a diary. It was a blueprint. The town didn't fall apart overnight, not with fire, not with scream, but with a slow unraveling that began the moment the last Keller was seen and never truly ended. Because some horrors don't shatter glass or burn bridges. They burrow, they root themselves in memory and morality, and rot from the inside out. And what Kettlewood Hollow became in the months following the fire was not a town reborn, but a hollow echo of what it once was, like a corpse dressed in Sunday clothes, smiling with lips sewn shut, because what had been unearthed at the Keller farmhouse was more than just bones and blood. It was complicity, it was appetite, and the people who had eaten, who had smiled and thanked the butcher, now walked with a new kind of weight, some heavy with guilt, others hardened by denial, and some, the worst of them, quiet in their relief that it wasn't their children, their wives, their brothers who'd hung from hooks in that cellar. The first to leave were the young mothers, clutching infants too innocent to know what had passed their lips, their eyes wide with fear that went deeper than words, and they were followed by the schoolteacher, the blacksmith's widow, even old Mr. Hale, who'd once sworn he'd die in his armchair, all of them packing in silence, slipping away like ghosts ashamed of having lingered too long. By winter, the schoolhouse was boarded up, the general store unmanned, and the church. Oh, the church, where sermons had once echoed with hymns of hope, now stood cold and hollow, the altar draped not in cloth but dust, because Pastor Wilhelm, after reading Hester Keller's diary and recognizing his own name listed among the trusted, fled without a word, leaving only a torn collar and a half-written note pinned to the pulpit. "Forgive me, Father, for I have fed them." The sheriff followed soon after, vanishing into the woods one morning, his badge left on his desk alongside a bottle of whiskey and a bundle of meat wrapped in Keller parchment, and the rumor was that he'd known all along, had been paid in bribes or silence, and though no one could prove it, no one wanted to, because what could justice even look like when the law had dined at the same table as the damned? Those of us who stayed did so not out of strength, but inertia, like stones too stubborn to roll, and we began to splinter, not violently, but fatally, like ice cracking beneath weight too long ignored. People stopped speaking to one another. Children were kept indoors, eyes averted. Meals were smaller. Those who'd once bought Keller meat held their shame in different ways. Mrs. Calhoun tried to atone by fasting every Sunday, falling thinner with each prayer. The Bristas adopted a stray girl from a neighboring county, swearing to raise her proper, as though love could erase the taste. And Mr. Ferguson, who'd once boasted his fondness for Keller sausages, hung himself in his barn with a string of them tied around his neck like a grotesque confession. And then there were those who refused to acknowledge anything at all, who insisted the meat had been from game, that the bones were a hoax, that the tooth found in Clara's stew had been planted by enemies. And these were the ones who frightened me most, because they looked you in the eye and smiled, Hollow smiles, brittle smiles, the kind that told you they hadn't faced the truth, not because they couldn't, but because they wouldn't. And I realized in that denial is its own kind of evil, quiet, persistent, like mold under floorboards. The children, too, bore scars. I watched them play less, speak less, some refusing to eat meat ever again, others sneaking into the woods at night to dare one another to approach the ruins, and one boy, Thomas Lee, burned down his father's barn after overhearing him joke about how tender the Keller's brisket had been. The psychological toll was beyond reckoning. Dr. Malvin, our only physician, reported cases of insomnia, night terrors, hallucinations, and what he called soul hunger, a gnawing emptiness that no food could fill. He tried to organize group therapy, prayer circles, town meetings, but each time fewer people came until eventually he too disappeared, leaving behind notes scrawled across his medical ledger. They never stopped being hungry. They passed it on. It's in us now. Whether he meant metaphor or madness, no one knew. The fields went fallow. The livestock withered. Nature itself seemed to recoil from the town, as though the earth had absorbed what we'd done and decided to deny us its bounty. The river dropped. The orchards refused bloom. The game thinned. Hunger returned. Not just in belly, but in mind, in spirit, a collective ache that spread through homes and hearts alike. I watched my own mother waste away, refusing meals, praying ceaselessly, her rosary clutched in bone-thin fingers that trembled not with age but dread. She never spoke Margaret's name again. Not once, as if to say it would make it real. And some nights I thought I heard her whisper to the shadows in our hallway, asking for forgiveness, asking if she'd ever see her daughter whole again. And me? I became an observer, a chronicler of sorts, walking the town with a notebook in hand, recording the decay, trying to make sense of the grief that had no name, no face, only teeth. People began to fear me. Some thought I was cursed, others said I was obsessed, but I didn't care, because someone had to remember, someone had to name what this town had become: a graveyard of appetite, a mausoleum of secrets. I stopped shaving, stopped attending gatherings. I spent my days at Margaret's tree, reading Hester's diary, reading my own notes, reading the silence between sentences, and wondering if the hunger had touched me too, if I had unknowingly carried it like a sickness in my blood. Because once you've seen what lies behind civility, once you've tasted the truth, you begin to wonder where it ends. And in Kettlewood Hollow, it never ended. It just changed form. There were whispers of Keller sightings in nearby towns. Isaac, older, his face fuller, working as a butcher's apprentice. Ruth, passing through train stations with child in tow. The twins, always together, always just out of reach. And though none were confirmed, the sightings were enough to keep the fear alive, to keep the townspeople glancing over their shoulders, wondering if the Keller doctrine had merely been transplanted, not destroyed. The idea that the family might have survived, might be thriving elsewhere, feeding new communities with the same cold conviction, was more than most could bear. And so we buried it, again, sealed the diary in the sheriff's safe, burned what meat remained in pantries, banned talk of the Kellers from public discourse. But silence is not justice. It is camouflage, and over time, the town faded from maps, its name spoken less, its existence erased from newer records. The children grew up and left. The elderly died off, and what was left was me, an old man in a decaying house, surrounded by memories I couldn't kill, haunted not by ghosts, but by hunger, not mine but theirs. The Keller hunger, the town's hunger, the hunger for forgetting. But I will not forget. I cannot, because buried in that hunger is a story, a warning. And if I let it die, then Kettlewood Hollow will vanish not from shame, but from cowardice. So I write, I remember, I dig, because somewhere beneath this town, beneath the cracked soil and the ruined barns and the church that no longer sings, something still festers. And silence, I've learned, is the surest fertilizer for evil, be why the time 2 decades had passed. The Keller farmhouse had collapsed into something barely recognizable. No longer a house, not quite a ruin, just a broken skeleton of scorched wood and creeping vines that seemed to grow faster than they should, like nature itself was trying to smother the memory of what happened there, to bury it in green and silence, and yet despite the rot in the years and the endless winters that had eaten away its edges. The place still felt alive in a way that made your skin itch, like something just under the soil was still breathing, and that was why I returned. Not for closure, not for answers, but because I needed to see for myself whether the hunger had truly died or if it had simply gone to sleep, waiting for the world to forget. I was 48 when I stepped onto that land again, boots crunchy over weeds and ash, eyes darting to where the Smokehouse used to stand, now just a blackened ring in the dirt, and I remember thinking that the wind felt wrong. Too warm for October, too still, like it was holding its breath along with me. The town was nearly gone by then, hollowed out to fewer than 30 souls, most of them too old or too stubborn to leave, their faces unfamiliar and wary, and when I asked about the Kellers, they shook their heads, not in denial but in exhaustion, like the name itself was a curse they refused to say aloud. "Let sleeping dogs lie," said the storekeeper, handing me a bag of flour with hands that trembled more from fear than age. But I didn't come for flour. I came for bones. I came to dig. The farmhouse had partially collapsed into the earth, its second floor a heap of shattered beams and shingles, and the front door was gone, replaced by a gaping mouth through which I could see glimpses of the past. The rusted stove, the corner where Abram once cleaned his cleavers, the spot on the wall where Margaret's hair ribbon had hung before it disappeared along with her. I stepped inside, every board beneath me groaning like it remembered who I was, and for a moment I thought I saw something move, just a flicker, a shadow, but it was gone before I could focus, and I told myself it was just memory playing tricks, just grief wearing a new face. I made my way to what was left of the cellar entrance, now half buried under debris and years of dust, and when I pried it open, the same cold breath rose from beneath, the scent of old blood and wet stone, undisturbed for decades, and as I descended, flashlight in hand, the darkness wrapped around me like a coat I used to wear and had never quite outgrown. The cellar was as I remembered. Stone walls, hooks on chains, the floor still bearing faint reddish stains, and in one corner, a pile of bones, smaller now, picked over by time or animals or perhaps something else, but still recognizably human, and I knelt before them, brushing away dirt, and whispered an apology I should have spoken years ago. That's when I heard it. A voice, low, male, not in the room, but behind me. "She forgave you." I turned, heart hammering, but the cellar was empty, just the wind above, just the old wood settling. But the voice! God help me, I knew that voice. It was the old man from the town records, the one who'd vanished months after the fire, the one some claimed had survived the raid and gone into hiding. Silas Keller, Abram's brother. He'd never been seen again. Until now. I raced up the stairs, out into the overgrowth, and there he was, at least, I think it was him, standing at the edge of the orchard, barely more than a silhouette in the fading light, face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, posture too still for someone breathing. And when I shouted, he turned and walked into the woods without a sound, disappearing before I could give chase. I searched for hours. Nothing. No footprints. No trail. But the fire had returned to my gut, the certainty that the hunger hadn't died, only scattered, and I began to dig, not just in the cellar, but in the garden behind the house, the place Hester once tended like it was holy, and after 2 feet of soil, I hit something hard. Wood. A crate. Inside bones. Dozens. Wrapped in cloth, marked with dates. Some recent. Post-fire. The Kellers had returned. At some point after the flames died and the town looked away, they came back. Not all of them. Maybe, but enough. Maybe they never left. Maybe they'd always known how to vanish, how to become smoke and whispers. And what chilled me most was that the bones were small, children's bones. They hadn't just resumed. They'd changed targets, grown bolder. I reported the find to what remained of the authorities. A deputy from the next county over, a man too young to remember the old stories. And when I handed him Hester's ledger, the diary, my notes, he read them with a pale face and shaking hands, then told me gently that these are just stories, and we need facts, as if facts could ever hold a candle to the truth. He promised to investigate. He never returned. Weeks later, I found tire tracks near the orchard, fresh ones, and footprints, children's, leading into the woods. No return trail. I followed them until they vanished into moss and silence. No bodies were found. No headlines, just whispers, just a taste of ash and old fear returning to my tongue like a flavor I never really forgot. And I knew without proof, without doubt, that the Keller hunger had survived. Not in the town, not in the farmhouse, but in the bloodline, in the ideology, in the bones buried deep enough that no one wanted to dig. So I stayed. I boarded up the cellar. I posted warnings. I wrote letters to newspapers, to historians, to churches. Most never responded. The ones who did laughed politely, nervously. They don't laugh when they meet me in person. They look away. They see what the town saw, what I've become. A relic, a warning, the last witness of a hunger. So old it no longer wears the mask of evil. It wears the face of necessity, of faith. The Keller house may rot, but the roots run deep. And I, tired, half-mad, aching with old grief, I dig, not to bury, but to uncover. Because if I stop, if I rest, I know it will grow here again. Hunger, dressed in kindness. Smiling with your neighbor's face that it was a cold spring morning when I finally found him. The last living link to the Keller bloodline. The boy who wouldn't speak. The one they never caught, never named, never questioned Ephraim or Elias. I still don't know which, because even now, after everything, he never gave me a name, never confirmed what I already knew in my bones, but I recognized him instantly, the way you recognize a sickness returning or a nightmare you thought you'd outgrown. He was, living under the name Eddie Bell in a crumbling boarding house outside Oshkosh, a butcher by trade, soft-spoken, clean-cut, and solitary, the kind of man who passed through life like a shadow stretched just a little too long, and I would never have found him if not for a slip, a butcher's receipt signed with a looping E. Keller, tucked into a ledger of meat sales archived at the county fairgrounds, a mistake that shouldn't have happened, and maybe didn't, maybe it was bait, maybe he wanted to be found, maybe he was just tired, because when I stood across from him at his counter, watching him slice through a slab of pork with a grace too methodical to be innocent, he didn't flinch, didn't pretend, didn't deny. It was his eyes, that deep, bottomless calm, the same look Ruth used to wear when she hummed lullabies near the Smokehouse. And when I said my name, when I said Margaret, I saw the flicker, barely there, but real, and still he said nothing. For hours I sat across from him in the back of the shop, the buzz of a single fly the only sound between us, and I told him everything, what I'd found in the cellar, what the town had become, how the bones never stopped surfacing, and he listened hand still, knife idle, until I showed him Hester's diary, the blood-smudged pages that detailed every meal, every child, every ritual, and that's when he finally moved, reaching out not for the book, but for the window latch, sealing it shut with a finality that made my chest tighten. Then, in a voice low and smooth like oil over stone, he said, "We never lied. We never took more than needed." And the dam broke inside me. I shouted. I cursed. I listed names, lives, people, my sister, who had vanished into smoke and meat and memory, and he just looked at me, unblinking, like I was the one who didn't understand. "You think it was madness," he said. "It was mercy. We fed them. We spared them." And when I demanded to know why the children, why the ledger, why the silence, he leaned closer and whispered, because no one else would do what was necessary. That's when I realized the truth. He didn't see himself as a monster. He saw himself as a savior, a custodian of balance, someone who had been given a sacred task and had carried it out without pride or pleasure, but with a terrible, unshakable duty. He told me stories, not confessions, not pleas for forgiveness, but histories, passed down from Hester to her children, about starvation in the old country, about famines where neighbors ate mud and bark while their children died screaming, and how their ancestors had made a vow, never again, never waste, never starve, use everything, use everyone. And he said it with such sincerity, such haunting conviction, that for a moment I felt sick, not from rage, not from fear, but from doubt, the creeping, soul-curdling realization that maybe, to them, it had always made sense. "We didn't kill for sport," he said. "We harvested what was forgotten, the broken, the lost, those no one missed." He looked me in the eye, like Margaret, and that, God help me, that shattered me. Because for a second I saw it not from his eyes, but hers, lured, maybe, or cornered, but not screaming, not dragged, just resigned, knowing it was over, knowing the town wouldn't save her, wouldn't look, wouldn't care. She was kind, he said softly. She deserved to be part of something bigger. We made sure she didn't go to waste. I lunged at him then, fists clenched, ready to end it, to choke the breath from his throat, but he didn't fight back. He just stood there, arms at his sides, and whispered, "Do it. You'll take my place." That stopped me, because he meant it, because in his mind, I was his enemy, I was his heir. I left the shop shaking, hands bloody from the counter's edge, the smell of raw meat clinging to my clothes like penance, and I never looked back, never returned, but I knew, God, I knew, that the hunger hadn't died. It had just grown teeth and learned to smile. I don't know where he is now. He vanished 2 days after my visit. The butcher shop burned to the ground. No bodies found. No arrests made. Just ash. Just smoke. Just a lingering taste of something too human in the air. And now I wonder, not if he's still alive, but how many like him are out there, quiet, devout, carrying knives passed down from mothers who called it mercy, fathers who called it faith. I used to believe evil was loud, violent, chaotic. But Ephraim or Elias, or whatever name he wears now, taught me that true evil is quiet, methodical, patient. It doesn't rush. It waits. It teaches. It grows. And it never forgets the taste I told myself I wouldn't return again, that what I'd seen in the cellar, in the shop, in Ephraim's or Elias's eyes was enough, more than enough, that my nightmares would finally settle if I just stayed away. But memory has a way of clawing its way back to the surface, and grief, true grief, doesn't fade, it ferments, it sharpens, and 2 years after that final encounter, I found myself once again standing before the shattered remains of the Keller farmhouse. Only, this time I wasn't alone, because I brought a shovel, a lantern, and the ghost of my sister's laugh tucked tight against my ribs like armor, and I returned not to mourn, not to reckon, but to dig. Not in the cellar, not in the smokehouse ruins, but in the garden where Hester Keller once whispered to herbs, where the soil was always too rich, too soft, too red, because someone had been calling to me in dreams, Margaret's voice rising beneath the hum of insects, telling me to look deeper, to stop pretending the worst was behind me. And so I did, under the dead light of crescent moon, my fingers blistered and raw, the shovel hitting roots, stones, and then a sound hollow, brittle, unmistakable, wood. A box, buried deep beneath the old tomato rows, and when I opened it, the smell rose like a scream, thick and ancient, and inside were bones, not old, not fossilized, but recent, clean, methodically arranged, and they weren't alone, because folded between femurs and ribs were scraps of cloth, pieces of metal, and one small locket, heart-shaped, rusted through, and inside it was a picture of a girl no older than 8, wide-eyed, smiling, the photo blurred, but the terror behind it screaming loud as sirens in my chest, because that child wasn't from our town, wasn't anyone I'd ever known, and yet her remains were here in the Keller soil, placed deliberately, like a message, a monument, and for the first time I realized what should have been obvious all along. The hunger hadn't been destroyed when the farmhouse burned. It had evolved, scattered like seeds, planted with precision, and the garden wasn't just a place of food, it was a graveyard, a repository of all the forgotten children, the lost souls no one ever came looking for. I dug more, found more boxes, 6 in total, some small, some heartbreakingly tiny, one containing nothing but teeth, each one a chapter in a story no one else wanted to read. And as I uncovered each box, I felt the weight of silence pressing down on me, the silence of a town that chose not to ask questions, the silence of neighbors who bought meat without receipts, the silence of a country that forgets it's missing faster than it mourns them. And I knew then that what the Kellers had done wasn't just murder, it was erasure. Erasure the unwanted, the unloved, the invisible. The diary had hinted at it. The ledger confirmed it. But this was proof. And it wasn't just historical. The bones dated years after the fire, after the raid, which meant someone, maybe Ephraim, maybe Ruth, maybe a student of theirs, had returned, had continued, and worse, had expanded. I took photos, cataloged everything, sent letters to journalists, historians, the state police. Most never replied. A few did, curious, cautious, asking for more evidence, and I sent them what I could, but no one came. No one ever came. And that's when I began to understand the final cruelty. The Kellers didn't just rely on hunger. They relied on apathy. They didn't hide in shadows. They hid in plain sight, behind smiles, behind fences, behind institutions too slow, too proud, too blind to see what was festering beneath their feet. I kept digging. Found another cache, this one beneath the old well, filled not with bodies but with tools, cleavers, hooks, notebooks filled with sketches of anatomy, pages of Hester's handwriting copied over and over like scripture, and at the bottom, a sealed envelope addressed to me by name. My name. Inside, a single piece of paper, yellowed and greasy, and on it were 5 words. We planted more than food. No signature. No threat. Just a statement. A truth. And I stared at those words until the sun rose, the light hitting the ruins in a way that made them look almost beautiful again, like the bones had bled out something pure, something real. But I knew better. There was no redemption in this soil. Only memory. Only warning. And now, I walk the property every week, checking for signs, disturbed earth, missing markers, footprints that don't belong. And every now and then, I find them, small signs, subtle shifts, like someone else is tending the garden, like I'm not the only one who remembers. And I leave markers, photos, scraps of Margaret's favorite song written on torn cloth. Not to warn them off, but to let them know I see them, that the story isn't buried yet. And sometimes when I wake, I find things on my porch, a jar of jam, a slice of smoked meat. A note with no name, just a drawing of a dinner table with an empty seat at its head. And I wonder if it's a threat or an invitation. Either way, I keep digging. Because if I stop, the garden will bloom again. And this time, the hunger might not wait for famine. It might come dressed in kindness, in neighborly smiles, in warm Sunday meals. And no one will see it. Not until the bones push up through the roots once more. It was the letters that broke me. Not the bones, not the whispers, not even the silence of the town that become a ghost of its former self, but the letters that started arriving one by one in envelopes that looked aged even when freshly delivered, their ink smeared but deliberate, always typed on the same yellow paper and signed unstamped, yet somehow always finding their way to my porch, to my mailbox, to my coat pocket when I wasn't looking, and each one carried a message that felt less like a threat and more like scripture, fragments of Hester Keller's missing writings, pages long believed lost in the fire, pages that weren't in the original diary, never seen in any ledger, but written in her unmistakable, steady cadence. And when I read them, something inside me cracked open, not from fear, not from revelation, but from a terrible familiarity, because they spoke not of horror, but of legacy, of training, of a hunger that was not simply taught, but inherited, passed down not through blood alone, but through memory, through ritual, through purpose. And the words slithered off the page and into the marrow of my bones with a calm conviction that made me sick, because they weren't stories, they were instructions. You've seen the proof, one letter began. You've tasted their ignorance. Now you understand why we continue. Another read, the hunger is not a curse. It's a compass. It tells us what matters most. Nothing must be wasted. And the worst one, the one that kept me up nights, said simply, you are the last witness. That makes you the first seed. At first, I burned them. Then I started keeping them, not out of curiosity, but out of dread, because deep down I understood the truth I didn't want to face. Someone was watching me, not to silence me, but to groom me, to shape me, to test whether I, too, would come to see things their way. It began with small gifts, packages left on my doorstep containing cured meats I dared not taste, jars of preserves labeled with dates that matched missing persons bulletins, trinkets from victims never recovered, all wrapped in the same coarse butcher paper the Kellers once used. And then came the animals. First a rabbit, then a stray dog, left in my yard, not killed in cruelty, but cleaned, prepared as if to say, see, you already understand. And worst of all, I started finding drawings, childlike, crude, but unmistakably familiar. Depictions of tables set for 5, of smokehouses, of cellars, and always of me, seated at the head of the table. My hands began to tremble without cause. I stopped eating meat altogether. I slept with a knife under my pillow. But none of it stopped the letters, and the more I tried to ignore them, the more direct they became. One morning, I found a page taped to my bathroom mirror, placed while I slept, and on it were these words, It's not madness if it keeps you alive. It's not evil if it feeds the innocent. You were hungry once. Remember? And I did remember. The war, the winter, the nights we went to bed empty, the taste of Keller meat, before I knew what it was. And I hated myself for knowing that at the time. It had been the best thing I'd ever eaten. That memory became a curse. I started dreaming of Margaret, not as she was, but as I imagined she'd looked in those final moments. Quiet, resolute, forgiving. In the dreams, she sat beside Hester at the table, smiled at me and said, "It was my choice." I woke each time in sweat, heart pounding, wondering if the dreams were being fed to me like the letters, like the gifts, like the hunger itself, a slow infection of the mind. Then, one evening, I found a letter that changed everything. Unlike the others, it came with an address, a small farm on the outskirts of another town, not Kettlewood Hollow, a new place, a new beginning. The letter said only, "If you truly seek to end it, come see what we built." I should have burned it. I should have warned the police. But I didn't, because part of me needed to know, not for revenge, not even for Margaret, but for certainty. Was the hunger truly dead, or had it simply evolved, grown smarter, more patient? I made the drive under a moonless sky, headlights the only light for miles, and when I arrived, what I found was not a nightmare, but something worse, a thriving little farm with a clean storefront, smiling workers and customers lined up for a fresh cut of meat, all of it legal, all of it pristine, and as I stepped inside, the smell hit me, not the smell of death, but a nostalgia of something warm and familiar, and there she was, Ruth, older, unchanged in her gaze, standing behind the counter as if not a day had passed, and when she saw me, she didn't scream, didn't run. She smiled. "We've been waiting," she said. "We knew you'd come." And behind her, children, apprentices, eyes bright, hands clean, eager. The future, it's not about survival anymore, Ruth explained. It's about sustainability. We don't kill. We select. We are careful now. We don't waste. She showed me a chart. Births, deaths, donations, a community off the grid, feeding itself, recycling itself. "We're not monsters," she whispered. "We're the solution. We always were." And I, broken, tired, filled with a horror that defied language, knew one thing as I backed away, as I stumbled out into the night. The hunger never left. It just got organized. And now, it wears a face the world will accept, clean, quiet, smiling. And I can feel it inside me now, like a seed planted by grief and watered by memory, growing quietly in the dark, whispering, "You could have saved them. You still can. Just don't let them go to waste." It ended, or at least I told myself it did, on a cold, dry night not far from the edge of Forgotten Town, where a new smokehouse stood nestled against a wooded hill, unmarked on maps, known only to a few, and it was there, beneath a sky drained of stars, that I faced what I can only describe as the end of the beginning, because by then I followed every trail, read every letter, seen every name scratched into butcher ledgers and bone-littered gardens, and I knew in my marrow that the Keller doctrine had not only survived but flourished, its roots winding quietly through counties and communities like a disease that doesn't kill but adapts, infecting not with gore but with justification, until even the most moral minds finds reason in the unimaginable. And I stood there, a worn-out man with shaking hands and a recorder tucked in my coat, heart galloping like a hunted animal, ready to capture what proof I could, hoping for justice but knowing deep down that I wasn't coming for evidence. I was coming for reckoning. The building looked new. Fresh lumber, clean hinges, even the garden outside, lavender and thyme swaying in the breeze. But the smell was old, timeless, that familiar blend of wood smoke and copper that sent my body into revolt, because I'd smelled it too many times before, in the Keller cellar, in Ephraim's butcher shop, in my own nightmares. I walked inside uninvited, no one there to stop me, the door creaking open like it expected me, and what I saw stopped my breath. Rows of meat hanging in perfect symmetry, polished hooks, spotless floors, and in the back, a table set for 5, plates empty, cutlery gleaming, and behind the table, a wall covered in photographs. Faces of the missing, hundreds of them, arranged with obsessive care, each labeled by date, location, presumed cut weight, a grotesque archive of a hunger that had become an institution. I stood frozen, and then a voice spoke, soft, behind me. "You came to stop it," Ruth said, stepping out from the shadows as if she'd been waiting her whole life for this moment. "But it's not a thing anymore. It's a system, a belief. You can't kill belief." Her face had aged, but her eyes hadn't, still burning with that quiet, unnerving calm, and she gestured for me to sit, as if we were old friends catching up over dinner, and when I refused, she didn't flinch. "You're not the enemy," she said. "You're the mirror." I told her I had everything. Photos, recordings, names, coordinates, and she nodded. "You think they'll listen? The press? The law? The same world that turned its back when your sister vanished? You think they'll do anything with your truth except bury it?" I said her name, Margaret, and Ruth's face finally shifted, just for a second, a sliver of something, regret, pride, before she said, "She made the choice. We all do." And then came the moment I'll never forget. A child stepped into the room, maybe 11, eyes bright, cheeks flushed from cold, and he handed Ruth a package wrapped in paper stained pink around the edges. She took it gently and offered it to me. "Her last cut," she said. "We saved it for you." I didn't move. I couldn't. And the boy just watched me. Curious, not cruel. He didn't know what he was part of. Not yet. Maybe he never would. Maybe they'd wrap it all in so much ritual and kindness and care that he'd believe it was salvation. Maybe that was the point. "You can destroy the building," Ruth said, setting the package on the table. "You can even kill me. But you can't kill hunger. Not the kind we feed." And for a moment, I thought I would. I thought I'd grab one of the cleavers from the wall. Silence her forever. But then I remembered what Ephraim had said, that to kill was to inherit. And I realized the final truth of their doctrine. It wasn't about the meat. It was about the choice, the participation, the quiet acceptance. They didn't just feed on flesh. They fed on silence, on complicity, on men like me who spent decades writing and digging but never acted. I walked out of that smokehouse without the package, without a word. I didn't burn it down. I didn't alert the police. Because I knew they'd vanish before anyone arrived. They always did. And I knew they'd rebuild, not out of malice, but out of purpose. And now, I sit here with boxes of documentation, a voice recorder filled with confessions, names of farms and warehouses and cooperatives, all tied to one central belief, that humanity's greatest lie is its claim to innocence when hunger arrives. I have not shared this story until now, because I needed you to read it all, to feel it, to see how deep it goes. And now that you have, I ask you only this. When the time comes, when the shelves are empty, when the world grows lean, when a neighbor offers you meat you can't trace, will you ask where it came from, or will you eat? Because the last smokehouse isn't on a map. It's not a place. It's a decision. And it could be anywhere, even next door, even in you.